This is Robert Morris. I'm with Professor Walter Kaufmann, and for the next several minutes we're going to be discussing existentialism. Professor Kaufmann, I'd like to start things off by suggesting that the term existentialism is very widely misunderstood. I'm wondering if you might want to comment on that as a beginning to our conversation.
I think there are good reasons for sometimes wondering whether there really is any such thing as existentialism. The person who coined that ism word, existentialism, was Jean-Paul Sartre, the great French writer, and he popularized the term right after World War II. And no sooner had he coined the word and won a great deal of attention all over the world than the two leading German existentialists, Martin Heidegger and Karl Jaspers, both said that if Sartre was an existentialist, they were not. Not only did they both dislike Sartre somewhat, but by that time they'd also come to dislike each other quite a lot. At one time, in the 1920s, they had been friends, and there had been some mutual stimulation, but partly for political reasons, during the Nazi period, they had become estranged, and by the time when Jean-Paul Sartre won international attention, they both felt that their differences were infinitely more important than anything they might have in common, either with each other or with him. The fourth writer, besides Sartre and Heidegger and Jaspers, who is very widely considered an existentialist and one of the seminal figures of the existentialist movement, is the Danish writer Søren Kierkegaard, was born in 1813 and died in 1855. Those who have read him would agree, I think, that if he had still been living in 1945, 1946, he too would have felt that if Sartre was an existentialist, he was not one. He too would have felt that his differences with Sartre far outweighed any similarities. It has often been remarked that he made fun of German philosophy in his time. Again, I think that if he had been living in the 1940s, he probably would have found Heidegger especially even funnier than the German philosophers of whom he made fun in his day. So that in the light of all this, one might come to the conclusion that existentialism is a term that could be applied only to Sartre's philosophy and not to anybody else's. But things are still worse than I've indicated so far. Sartre in 1945-46 rather liked to think of himself as an existentialist, but subsequently he became more and more interested in Marxism, and by 1961, in his Search for a Method, which has been published in English translation too, he described Marxism as the philosophy of our time and disparaged existentialism as merely a parasitical phenomenon on the margins of knowledge, and by knowledge he meant Marxism. So even Sartre now no longer particularly likes that term for his own philosophy. And under these circumstances, one might wonder whether the term is useful at all. I still think it has some usefulness, provided one uses it sensibly. Ism words in philosophy are generally suspect, and nevertheless worth using with caution. One does speak of British empiricism, and it's what one might call an elegant variation for saying Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. Sometimes one refers to these three philosophers as the British empiricists. And sometimes, instead of saying Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, one says the continental rationalists. And sometimes, instead of saying Peirce and James and Dewey, one says the American pragmatists. And in every one of these cases, these men consider the differences much more important than anything that they might have had in common. But this is precisely why the term is useful, why the ism terms have some legitimate use. If a man defines his contribution to philosophy very largely in terms of his differences with a predecessor, then in order to understand him, one also has to study his predecessor. And so to understand what makes Spinoza important, one has to know something about Descartes. And in order to understand what makes Leibniz important, one has to know something about both Descartes and Spinoza. As long as 3 or 4 people are best studied together, because to understand the distinctive contributions one has to compare them, it is quite useful to have a label for linking them all, and that is the legitimate use of ism words. So I would say that it makes good sense to use the word existentialism for primarily Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Jaspers, and Sartre, as long as we don't suppose that they all agree and that they all have the same philosophy, which they do not. Of course, that raises the question whether there is anything interesting that they do have in common. There needn't be. The term would be useful even if they didn't. But I think there is something that they all have in common. Now, I think what I've said so far is really not particularly controversial. I think people who are at home in the literature would probably agree this far. But when we raise the question as to what Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Jaspers, and Sartre have in common, I think different people would make different suggestions. And I'd like to comment on one suggestion that I think is at best half true, but that is also half false, and point out what's wrong with it before I make a suggestion of my own that I believe will stand up rather better. The half-true suggestion that doesn't stand up too well is that what the existentialists have in common is that they are somehow closer to existence, closer to real life, that they are less academic. The assumption is that most philosophers, including most English-speaking philosophers, after all wrote books that are mostly for philosophy professors or graduate students or perhaps sometimes undergraduates as well, while the existentialists, supposedly, have written for a much larger audience and are less academic and closer to real-life problems. As I say, there is some truth in that, but there's also something wrong with that. Anyone who has tried to read the major philosophical works, even of Kierkegaard, and quite especially of Heidegger and Jaspers and Jean-Paul Sartre, works like Heidegger's Being and Time and Sartre's Being and Nothing, must be struck by the fact that these are books that really are for philosophy professors and graduate students and very, very hard to understand, while much of Locke and Berkeley and Hume and John Stuart Mill and Bertrand Russell is really much easier to understand. So something must be wrong with this suggestion. Nevertheless, there's some element of truth in it. Now, my own suggestion tries to bring out the element of truth. It is that these so-called existentialist philosophers agree about what is the best starting point for philosophical reflection. I think they all, 4 of them, and some other philosophers who in this respect are close to them as well, believe that the best starting point for philosophical reflection is what is sometimes called ultimate situations or extreme situations. They are some of our most intense experiences. One word for them would be Jaspers' German term, Grenzsituationen, which means literally border situations. The preeminent example would be the experience of our own death, when we are not actually dying, but when we are, so to say, sweating out our death in anticipation. Sweating it out, expecting that very soon we are going to die. Illustrations of this are common in existentialist literature. For example, Jean-Paul Sartre's short story, The Wall, but also in some of Sartre's plays, this is a prominent motif. We have the same sort of thing in Sartre's philosophical work, where he deals with this experience of one's own death, where one doesn't just think that one dies, or that one must die, or that all men are mortal, but when one anticipates one's own death very really, very existentially. We have the same concern a little earlier in Heidegger's philosophical work, and of course it is also familiar to us from Camus' novels. And the stranger, the hero or anti-hero of the book, through much of the book, is in prison and looks forward to his own execution. In Camus' second novel, The Plague, a whole city is struck by the plague, and the people in that city live with the very immediate anticipation of their own death. So this is one kind of extreme situation. Others would be what Kierkegaard called, in the title of one book, Fear and Trembling, in the title of another book, Dread. This dread, this anxiety, is a very central motif in existentialist literature, including the philosophical works of the existentialists. And a third motif would be what Kierkegaard calls in the title of another book, The Sickness Unto Death, which is despair. And to give just one more example, the guilt feelings.